You were never really my son, not the way he is. My father's voice carried over the clinking silverware and low chatter of the crowded diner, slicing the air so cleanly that forks paused mid-air and conversations froze into silence as eyes turned toward me. Toward the man who had spent 2 decades keeping the family name afloat while my brother drank away his 20s and 30s. And I swear in that moment the heat rose in my chest so violently I could hear the blood in my ears louder than the jukebox in the corner that had just dropped into an old Springsteen track, and then he pushed the knife in deeper, looking straight at me while holding my brother's shoulder. This is my only real son, the one who matters. And the applause from two of his drinking buddies who sat across the booth felt like a sick joke at my expense, while my mother stared down at her coffee, too cowardly to meet my eyes, and my brother smirked like he'd been waiting for this coronation his whole wasted life. Before we get deeper into this story, make sure you're subscribed, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from. I sat there with the bitter taste of burnt diner coffee still on my tongue, staring at my father as if the man across from me had been replaced by some cruel imposter. And though my hands trembled under the table, I forced myself to breathe, to stay calm, because what no one in that room knew was that I had been preparing for something like this for a long time, though not in the way they imagined. A quiet card tucked up my sleeve, one advantage I had kept hidden, waiting for the day loyalty would finally be paid back with betrayal. My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm 38 years old, and I was born and raised in Dayton, Ohio, the kind of Midwest city where people still wave at you when you drive down side streets, and where reputation lingers longer than memory. And growing up there taught me two things: family is everything, and once it breaks, it cuts deeper than any stranger ever could. The diner smelled like bacon grease and old linoleum, the kind of place my parents loved because they'd been going there since the 80s, when the walls were still yellow from cigarettes and the waitress called everyone Hun. And I could still remember sitting in that same booth as a kid after Little League, my dad bragging about my home runs to anyone who would listen. Back when I thought I could earn his love by performing, by winning, by never failing, never letting him down. And yet here I was, a man who had put him and my mother into a house I bought outright when the bank threatened foreclosure, who paid for her hip surgery when Medicare refused, who covered his gambling debts quietly so the neighbors never whispered, and I was being erased in a single public declaration while my brother Mark, drunk half the time and unemployed the other half, basked in the glow of a crown he never earned. I remember the hush of the diner, the way strangers stared at me with pity, some pretending to look away but unable to, the scrape of a chair leg, the sound of someone clearing their throat as though embarrassed for me, and inside I wanted to rage, to flip the table, to shout the truth. But years of self-discipline and corporate boardrooms had taught me that silence is a weapon sharper than words. And so I simply nodded, finished my coffee, and let them believe I was broken because in that moment a seed planted itself in my mind. Their humiliation would not go unanswered, and when the time came, they would understand the cost of turning their backs on me. Mark leaned over and said, loud enough for the waitress to hear, "Guess you're not Daddy's boy after all, huh, Danny?" And the laughter that followed burned worse than the insult itself, but I just smiled, a thin, cold smile he mistook for surrender. Years earlier, on the day my grandfather died, my father had given me a small brass compass that belonged to him, saying, "This will always point you home," and I had carried it through college, through sleepless nights at my first job, through the move to New York when I built my business, a reminder that no matter how far I went, I was still tethered to the Mercers of Dayton, Ohio. That compass sat in my pocket now, heavy, almost mocking, and I realized with brutal clarity that home was no longer a place, it was a battlefield, and I was standing at the edge of war. By the time the check came and my father paid, deliberately sliding the cash across to the waitress in a flourish as if to prove he didn't need me, I already knew I would not confront him here, not today. I walked out into the cold Ohio air, the late November wind sharp with the smell of exhaust and wet leaves. And while they laughed behind me, while my brother's voice carried out the door in some crude joke about my suits and city life, I whispered to myself the truth I dared not say aloud. They had just written me out of the family in public, but in doing so, they had given me the freedom to write the ending myself. That night, lying awake in the house I had bought for them, but still technically owned, I stared at the ceiling, the old plaster cracked like veins, and I thought about how betrayal never comes from enemies, it only comes from those you kept closest, those you fed, those you loved. And with the compass on my nightstand glinting in the dim glow of the streetlight outside, I made a silent vow. They wanted to humiliate me, to crown Mark as heir while turning me into a ghost, but by the time this story was finished, They would wish they had never chosen sides. I played the part of the forgotten son flawlessly, letting them believe I was wounded, defeated, stripped of my place, and for weeks after that night at the diner, my father and brother paraded their new alliance across Dayton like it was gospel. Mark riding shotgun in Dad's old Chevy pickup, stopping at the VFW hall where Dad introduced him as my pride, my legacy, while neighbors clapped his back and offered him drinks he never paid for, and I made sure I wasn't there. Made sure the silence around me deepened, because the more invisible I became, the more they believed they had erased me, and the more I could work unseen. It started with little things. I let the utilities on the house slide into their names, quietly transferring the bills I had always covered, and I watched from a distance as the cracks appeared. Dad grumbling at the rising costs he never bothered to understand. Mark swearing he'd pick up work any day now, but always finding another excuse. And though they mocked me at the bar and rolled their eyes at my absence from Sunday dinner, the first flicker of unease passed through their lives without them knowing the source. They thought they were kings. I knew they were tenants in a castle I still owned. That compass sat heavy in my pocket everywhere I went, a reminder of the bloodline they thought they had cast me out of. But every time my thumb brushed the smooth brass, I remembered my vow, and with each week that passed, the plan sharpened. Outwardly, I played my role. Distant, maybe humiliated, too busy with my city life to notice the insults, but inside I was measuring their every weakness, and time was always on my side. What stung, though, was my mother. She didn't look at me at the diner, and she didn't call me after, not once, as though siding with Dad was easier than acknowledging the son who had held her hand through her surgeries, who had fought with doctors to give her better treatment, who drove 4 hours from New York just to bring her Thanksgiving dinner, when Dad gambled away the grocery money 1 year. Her silence hurt worse than my father's words, and when I saw her once at Kroger, standing in the cereal aisle, she turned away quickly, pretending to study the boxes like she hadn't noticed me, and I realized she wasn't going to save me, wasn't going to correct the lie. That was when I understood that this wasn't just a feud, it was erasure, and they were rewriting the family story without me in it. I let that pain simmer, then buried it deep under ice because rage without patience is just noise and I needed quiet. My business in New York was still thriving, the contracts steady, my income more than secure, but I didn't flaunt it, didn't call them, didn't defend myself when Dad told neighbors that Danny lost everything in some stock scheme and Mark's the only one I can count on. Lies travel fast in a small town, but I let them. I wanted the illusion to spread, because humiliation only has teeth when you pretend it bites. Meanwhile, in silence, I met with an attorney downtown, a woman named Calloway who had handled property disputes for years, and she told me what I already knew, that legally, the deed to the house was mine, that I had been covering the taxes under my own name, that if I wanted, I could end this game in one swift motion. But I shook my head and said, not yet. Because an eviction would hurt, yes, but humiliation had to be poetic. It had to mirror what they had done to me, and a part of me wanted them to walk willingly into the trap, smiling, certain they had won, only to feel the floor collapse beneath their feet. Still, the tension built. One Sunday, when I finally forced myself to go to church with them, the pastor gave a sermon on the prodigal son, and afterward Dad clapped Mark on the shoulder in the fellowship hall, telling everyone within earshot how proud he was to see his boy back on the right path. And the crowd nodded, even the ones who knew better, because people love a redemption arc even when it's fake. And I stood there, shaking hands with parishioners who avoided meeting my eyes, knowing full well they pitied me. Mark strutted past me, whispering, "Guess you're just a footnote now." And for the first time I almost broke, almost snapped in the middle of the church, but then I felt the compass in my pocket and forced myself to breathe. That night, alone in my car outside their house, I saw through the lit window my father handing Mark an envelope, his face glowing with pride, and later I learned he had signed over his old insurance policy to Mark, naming him the sole beneficiary as though I had never existed. The insult was almost laughable. Dad never had much in savings, and the policy wouldn't amount to more than a few $1,000s. But it wasn't the money. It was the symbolism, the final stroke of the brush painting me out of the family portrait. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles ached, but instead of despair, a strange calm washed over me. They thought this was the peak of their victory, but I knew better. Because beneath their laughter, their borrowed confidence, their barroom boasts, I saw the truth. They were leaning on money they didn't control, property they didn't own, and reputation they hadn't earned. And when those things vanished, they would collapse. The first crack came sooner than I expected. A month later, a storm rolled through Dayton, heavy winds that knocked shingles off the house and sent water leaking into the living room. Mark tried patching it himself, standing on the roof with a beer in his hand and duct tape in his pocket. But when the ceiling caved in above the TV, they called me, not directly, but through a cousin who asked if I could maybe chip in for repairs. I told her calmly, it's not my place anymore. Dad has his son now. She didn't argue, just sighed, and I knew the message would travel back. For the first time, Dad and Mark tasted what it meant to rely only on each other. But then came a twist I hadn't planned. Dad marched into my office downtown one Tuesday, red-faced, demanding to know why I had stopped covering their taxes, why letters from the county had started arriving. I looked at him across my polished desk, the city skyline glowing behind me, and I said, "You told the world I wasn't your son. So why would I pay a father's bills?" The silence stretched long, his face twisted, and for a flicker of a second, I thought he might break, might apologize. But then his pride surged back and he spat, "You'll regret this. Mark will outshine you in ways you'll never imagine." He slammed the door, storming off, and I sat there, staring at the compass on my desk, knowing I had just won a small victory, but also that the storm ahead was far from over. Because humiliations never come in one wave, they build, crest, and then crash all at once. And as much as I wanted to savor his panic, I couldn't ignore the annoying truth. I had underestimated just how far they were willing to go to erase me completely. The letters kept coming, the kind of thick, official envelopes no one likes to open, stamped with county seals and deadlines, and while my father let them pile on the kitchen counter beside overdue utility bills and takeout menus, I knew every one of them was a countdown clock ticking louder by the week. But instead of facing the truth, he doubled down on the lie, strutting around Dayton as though nothing had changed, dragging Mark with him to bars and cookouts, introducing him again and again as his heir, his right hand, his legacy. What he didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that I had already moved 3 steps ahead, because humiliation alone wasn't enough anymore. I wanted them to feel the weight of their choices pressing in from every side until there was nowhere left to turn. Quietly, through Callaway, I began the paperwork to reclaim the house. Not by eviction, not by force, but through foreclosure triggered by their unpaid taxes, a process so slow and bureaucratic they wouldn't notice until it was too late, and while the wheels turned in the county office, I let them bask in their delusion. The compass never left my pocket, each brush of my thumb against its smooth brass face reminding me that time was the true weapon, not anger, and patience would make the knife cut deeper. Still, there were moments when I almost faltered, like the night I overheard my father at a Lions Club meeting, standing before men who had known me since boyhood, declaring that I was nothing but a city snake who abandoned his roots, while Mark sat behind him, nodding smugly, as if every insult were a brick building his throne. The sting of betrayal mixed with the metallic taste of rage, but I kept my face blank, knowing that silence was still my shield. Then came the deadline, 90 days until foreclosure if taxes remained unpaid. I circled it on my calendar in red ink, not as a reminder but as a finish line, the day the narrative would flip, the day their triumph would collapse into dust. In the meantime, I began weaving threads they couldn't see. I reached out to the very bar owners and neighbors who listened to Dad's boasts, quietly offering sponsorships, donations, favors in exchange for small bits of information. How often Dad drank there, what Mark bragged about, who they confided in after too many beers, and slowly the picture formed. Mark had been spreading a story that I was broke, drowning in debt, my business a hollow shell propped up by lies. He even claimed I'd begged him for money once, a story ridiculous enough to make me laugh in private, but dangerous enough to become truth in a town where whispers are gospel. That was when I realized his motive wasn't just greed, it was humiliation. He didn't just want Dad's approval, he wanted me erased. Publicly, permanently, the successful older brother reduced to a cautionary tale while he rose from the ashes as some kind of savior. And Dad, blinded by jealousy he'd harbored since I first left for New York, since I first came back wearing tailored suits and driving a car better than his, swallowed it whole. The betrayal was layered money on the surface, yes, but beneath it the rotting core of envy and resentment that had festered for years. The tension tightened when a cousin's wedding rolled around that summer, an event that gathered every branch of the Mercer family tree into one rented hall strung with twinkle lights and cheap champagne, and though I debated skipping it, I knew appearances mattered, that showing up quietly was more powerful than absence. I walked in wearing a gray suit. Not flashy, just sharp, and heads turned. Whispers followed, because the rumors had painted me broke, but my presence contradicted them. Dad stood near the dance floor, drink in hand, Mark at his side, and when he saw me, a hush seemed to ripple through the room. He smirked, raised his glass, and in a voice loud enough for all to hear said, "Look who crawled back, the prodigal who lost everything. Don't worry, son, we'll save you a seat at the kids' table." Laughter erupted, cruel and nervous, and my stomach churned with humiliation. But I forced a calm smile, lifting the compass from my pocket just enough to glance at it before slipping it back. No words, no reaction. That silence unnerved him more than any retort. I could see it in the twitch of his eye. Hours later, as I sat outside smoking a rare cigarette, my mother approached, her face pale, her hands trembling slightly. She whispered, "Danny, maybe you should just let it go. Your father's set in his ways, and Mark, well, he's fragile. Don't make things worse." I wanted to scream, to ask how much worse it could get, but instead I just nodded, staring at the glowing ember of the cigarette, as though it might answer me. Her complicity was a second betrayal, softer but sharper, and I knew then that none of them would stand beside me when the tide turned. They had chosen their side fully. But what they didn't realize was that the tide was already shifting. Behind the scenes, Calloway had uncovered something hidden in the property records. A lien against the house from one of Dad's old gambling debts, unpaid for years, long forgotten by him but still very much alive in the county's files. It meant foreclosure wasn't the only sword hanging over head. Creditors could claim the property once the taxes tipped the scale, and with my name on the deed, I had the power to decide whether to shield them or let the wolves in. I chose silence. Let the wolves come. Each day closer to the deadline, I saw the panic in my father's eyes grow sharper, though he never admitted it, still clinging to Mark as if his delusion could hold the world together. Mark, drunk with borrowed power, strutted through town, bragging about renovations he planned for the house, about how he would one day turn the place into a legacy estate. And the irony nearly choked me, because the house wasn't his to dream about, never was. The trap was tightening, and neither of them knew their crown was made of paper. The mini reveal came one night in July when I ran into Mark at a gas station on the edge of town. He was drunk, stumbling toward the counter with a case of beer, and when he saw me, he laughed, slurring, "What's it like, Danny? Watching everything you built slip through your fingers while Dad calls me his son? Bet it burns." I didn't answer. I just paid for my gas and walked toward the door, but then he shouted after me, "Oh, I almost forgot Dad's leaving me the house too, not that you ever cared. Guess you'll be homeless when we kick you out, huh?" The cashier's eyes widened, a smirk on his lips, and I felt the sting of humiliation like a hot brand, but instead of rage, I smiled. Because in that drunken boast, Mark had revealed something he didn't realize. Dad had already promised him the house, already convinced himself he had the power to give it, which meant when the hammer fell, the betrayal would cut him as deeply as it cut me. They were building a future on sand, and soon, very soon, the tide would wash it away. As I drove off into the humid Ohio night, windows down, cicadas screaming in the trees, I held the compass in my palm and whispered to it like a vow, "Not long now." The 90-day deadline arrived with the same quiet inevitability as the changing seasons, unnoticed by my father and brother until the certified letter landed in their mailbox one damp morning in late August. A warning in black ink that foreclosure proceedings had begun, and when word spread through the neighborhood that the Mercer house, the one I had bought outright, the one Dad boasted was his fortress, was on the chopping block. The whispers turned sharp, pity mixing with curiosity, and I knew the stage was finally set. I stayed invisible at first, letting panic bloom unchecked in their kitchen, letting Mark rage and Dad curse the county, letting my mother wring her hands at the sink as though wringing could wash away debts decades old. And when Dad finally worked up the courage to call me, his voice cracked in a way I hadn't heard since childhood. But I let it ring out on voicemail, listening later to his desperate plea. "Danny, we need you." "The house your mother, this isn't right. You can't let them take it." I replayed it twice, each word sinking into me like a stone, but instead of guilt, I felt a calm clarity, because this was never about the house, it was about the story he had told, the crown he had placed on Mark's head while casting me into shadow, and stories only end when someone writes the final line. I called Calloway and told her it was time. Within a week, Proceedings accelerated, and invitations went out for the sheriff's sale, a public auction of the property where bidders could line up to take a piece of the Mercers' so-called legacy. The symbolism was almost too perfect. The same public humiliation they had scripted for me now boomeranged back, except this time it wasn't in a diner or a church hall. It was on the courthouse steps, with neighbors, old friends, and half the town gathered to watch. The morning of the sale, the sky hung low with heavy gray clouds, the air thick with the smell of impending rain, and I arrived early, standing off to the side in a navy suit, compass in my pocket pressing against my chest like a second heartbeat. Dad showed up 20 minutes late, dragging Mark along in a wrinkled shirt, both of them red-eyed and grim, and when they saw me, their faces twisted into something between fury and fear. The sheriff read out the terms. The crowd buzzed with anticipation, and as the auction began, I let the first few bids roll in from strangers, watching my father shift nervously, whispering to Mark about finding a way to buy it back later. But when the number hit a threshold I knew they could never touch, I stepped forward, raised my hand, and in a clear voice announced my bid cash, full amount, uncontested. The crowd murmured, gasps rippling like a wave, and I saw in my father's eyes the exact moment the floor dropped out beneath him, the realization that the house was mine again, legally and irreversibly, not as his dutiful son but as the man he disowned, the ghost he tried to erase. The gavel came down with a sharp crack, final and merciless, and the whispers turned into a roar of gossip that would carry through Dayton for years. Daniel Mercer bought his parents' house out from under them. But the twist was still coming. Because I didn't stop at buying it, I handed the paperwork to Calloway and instructed her to list the property for immediate sale, not to keep it, not to move back in, but to erase the illusion of home entirely. And when my father stormed up to me afterward, spitting venom, Mark behind him trying to puff up like a guard dog, I pulled the compass from my pocket and held it between us, the brass catching the weak sunlight. "You gave this to me once," I said, my voice steady enough that the bystanders leaned in to catch every word. "You told me it would always point me home. But the truth is, home was never a house, never a name, never your approval. Home is wherever I stand when I stop letting you define me." I closed my hand around it, turned my back on him, and walked away, leaving him shouting in the rain, his words swallowed by thunder. The double twist came later that week, when the sale went through faster than expected, and I donated a large portion of the proceeds, not to charity, not to strangers, but to the very community programs my father had mocked for years. Scholarships for local kids, rehab funding for veterans, a new roof for the church he used to sit in while praising Mark's false redemption. The story spread like wildfire, reframing everything they had tried to write about me. Suddenly I wasn't the prodigal failure. I was the benefactor, the man who had quietly carried Dayton while his father and brother drank and bragged. The humiliation for them was total. Neighbors stopped listening to Dad's boasts. Bar owners cut off Mark's tabs. The VFW hall that once clapped for them now turned cold shoulders, and in every whispered conversation at grocery stores and gas stations, the legend shifted. The only real son was revealed as nothing but a drunk, while the discarded one had been the backbone all along. My mother tried to call, her voice brittle with regret, but I let it go to voicemail the same way I had with my father, because forgiveness isn't owed, it's earned, and they had long since spent whatever credit they once had. And me? I packed up the compass in a small wooden box, placed it on a shelf in my New York office, no longer carrying it daily because it had done its job. It had reminded me that loyalty is sacred only when it's mutual, that betrayal can be transformed into something sharper than vengeance: freedom. For the first time in years, I slept without bitterness clawing at me, knowing I had not only reclaimed the narrative but rewritten it entirely. The revenge wasn't just that I won, it was that they lost themselves, trapped in the wreckage of their own pride, while I walked away lighter, untethered, finally free of the home that was never really home at all. If you enjoyed this story, please give a thumbs up to the video and consider subscribing to the channel for more powerful true life stories.